I still remember the exact moment when my mother-in-law Diane laughed at my business idea during their fancy Thanksgiving dinner. A tech startup? Oh, Sarah dear, wouldn't you be happier in something more suitable for a Mitchell wife? The entire family chuckled, except Michael, who stared at his plate. What they didn't know then was that 3 years later, I'd be sitting across from them in a boardroom, holding the financial lifeline to their crumbling family legacy. Sometimes, the most powerful revenge comes dressed in a business suit with a term sheet in hand. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The email arrived on a rainy Tuesday morning. I was reviewing code with my development team when my phone buzzed with a notification. The sender's name made my heart skip. Robert Mitchell, my father-in-law. In 4 years of marriage to Michael, I'd received exactly 3 emails from Robert, all formal invitations to Mitchell family events where my attendance was required rather than requested. I excused myself from the meeting and retreated to my small but meticulously organized office. My company, Neuroleap, occupied half a floor in a converted textile factory in Cambridge. It wasn't the gleaming glass tower that housed Mitchell Financial Services in downtown Boston, but it was mine, built from the ground up with determination that the Mitchells had consistently underestimated. We need to discuss an urgent family matter, the email read. Dinner at our home, Thursday at 7 p.m. Business formal attire required. No greeting, no pleasantries. Perfectly on brand for Robert Mitchell. I sighed, setting my phone down next to my laptop where our company's latest neural interface prototype glowed on the screen. We were 6 weeks away from our Series B funding announcement, and I was drowning in pitches, demos, and investor meetings. A formal Mitchell family dinner was the last thing I needed, especially since these gatherings inevitably became showcases for how I didn't quite measure up to their standards. Everything okay? Asked Priya, my CTO and oldest friend from MIT. She leaned against my doorframe, concern etched across her face. Mitchell family summons, I replied, turning my screen to show her the email. Apparently, it's urgent. Priya rolled her eyes. In the 4 years since we'd founded Neuroleap together, she'd heard every condescending comment, every backhanded compliment the Mitchells had thrown my way. What's urgent? Did someone use the wrong fork at the country club? I laughed despite the knot forming in my stomach. Probably. Or maybe Jennifer finally realized that her wedding photos were ruined because I wore navy instead of royal blue. You going to go? I thought about Michael, who had stood beside me through most of the Mitchell family drama, even when it meant enduring his father's disappointment. He'd chosen a career in educational psychology over joining the family financial firm, the first Mitchell in 3 generations to break tradition. His choice had made him something of a family disappointment, though they carefully masked their disapproval as concern about his future. Yes, I'll go, I told Priya. But I'm not rescheduling the Westbrook demo. If we finish early, I'll make the end of dinner. Priya nodded approvingly. Progress. A year ago, you would have canceled everything to appease them. She was right. When I first married Michael, I'd bent over backwards trying to fit into the Mitchell family mold. I'd changed my wardrobe, modified my speech patterns, even temporarily scaled back my work hours, all in pursuit of approval that never came. It had taken the near collapse of my first startup for me to realize that I was sacrificing my authentic self at the altar of Mitchell family acceptance. That evening, I drove home to our modest 2-bedroom condo in Somerville. It wasn't the stately Beacon Hill townhouse that the Mitchells thought appropriate for one of their own, but it was perfect for us, equidistant between my office in Cambridge and Michael's community counseling center in Medford. Michael was already home, preparing dinner while listening to one of his psychology podcasts. The sight of him, sleeves rolled up, totally absorbed in carefully measuring spices, filled me with a familiar wave of gratitude. Here was the one Mitchell who had never tried to change me. "Hey," I called, setting down my laptop bag. "I got an email from your dad today." Michael looked up, his expression shifting from contentment to wariness. What did he want? "Urgent family dinner on Thursday night. Business formal attire." I mimicked Robert's serious tone as I moved to kiss Michael's cheek. Did he say what it's about? Nope. Just urgent family matter. I grabbed a bottle of water from the fridge. But I have the Westbrook demo that afternoon, so I told him I might be late. Michael raised an eyebrow. "You told my father you'd be late. To a family dinner?" I told his executive assistant, I clarified with a small smile. "I'm making progress, not seeking martyrdom." Michael laughed, then grew serious. "I haven't heard anything about family emergencies. Mom called yesterday to remind me about Jennifer's baby shower next month, but she didn't mention any urgent matters. Maybe Mitchell Financial Services finally decided to enter the 21st century and wants my tech advice," I joked, though we both knew that was about as likely as Robert wearing jeans to a board meeting. "Maybe," Michael said, though his tone suggested he was as puzzled as I was. "Either way, we'll face it together." Together. The word had become our mantra throughout the challenges of navigating our relationship within the constraints of Mitchell, family expectations. Michael had consistently chosen us, chosen me, over the legacy his parents had planned for him. It couldn't have been easy, walking away from the wealth and privilege that awaited him at Mitchell Financial Services. But he'd been resolute, insisting that his passion lay in helping struggling students, not managing hedge funds for the ultra-wealthy. The next day passed in a blur of investor calls and prototype refinements. Neuroleap was developing non-invasive neural interfaces that helped patients with mobility challenges control prosthetics using only their thoughts. It was cutting-edge technology with applications that extended far beyond medical use, which made it both exciting to technologists and terrifying to traditionalists, like the Mitchells. I still remember the first time I tried to explain my work to Diane Mitchell over dinner at their Beacon Hill home. She'd blinked rapidly, turned to Michael, and asked if I wouldn't prefer to use my engineering degree for something more suitable, like designing jewelry or home appliances. When I'd politely explained that neural interfaces were my passion, she'd patted my hand condescendingly and changed the subject to Jennifer's latest charity gala. That had been just one of countless moments where I'd felt the subtle but persistent message. You don't belong here. Your ambitions are inappropriate. Your work is unsuitable. Your background is insufficient. Unlike the Mitchells, who could trace their Boston lineage back to the 1800s, I had grown up in a middle-class neighborhood in Pittsburgh. My father was a high school physics teacher. My mother ran a small bookstore. They had scrimped and saved to send me to MIT, beaming with pride, when I graduated at the top of my class. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Their idea of a fancy dinner was the Olive Garden with dessert included. They were warm, loving, and genuinely interested in people regardless of their net worth or social connections. In other words, they were everything the Mitchells were not. Thursday arrived, and with it came the Westbrook demo, a crucial meeting with a potential major investor. I wore my power outfit, a tailored charcoal suit that had cost more than my monthly rent, but had already paid for itself in investor confidence. The demo went brilliantly, with the Westbrook team asking thoughtful questions and showing genuine enthusiasm about our technology's potential applications. By the time we wrapped up, it was 6:45 p.m., making it mathematically impossible to reach Beacon Hill by 7 DAO. I texted Michael, "Demo went great, running late, start without me?" His reply came quickly, "Already here, something's definitely up." Dad looked stressed. Mom's on her third martini. That was unusual. Robert Mitchell prided himself on his unflappable demeanor, and Diane rarely had more than a single, precisely measured drink at family functions. Whatever this urgent family matter was, it seemed legitimately concerning. I arrived at the Mitchell family home at 7:32 p.m., parking my modest hybrid behind Jennifer's gleaming luxury SUV. The house looked as it always did, imposing, immaculate, old money made physical in the form of brick and wrought iron. I took a deep breath before climbing the steps to the front door, mentally preparing for the subtle barbs about punctuality that would surely follow. Henderson, the Mitchells' longtime housekeeper, greeted me with his usual formal nod. "They're in the dining room, Mrs. Mitchell. Shall I take your coat?" "Thank you, Henderson." I handed him my raincoat, checked my appearance in the ornate hallway mirror, and squared my shoulders. Whatever awaited me in that dining room, I would face it with the same determination that had built Neuroleap from a concept to a company valued at 8 figures. The Mitchell dining room was a study in traditional wealth: crystal chandelier, mahogany table that could seat 20, oil paintings of stern-faced ancestors judging every bite taken beneath them. The family was already seated, Robert at the yi, head of the table, Diane to his right, Michael to his left. Jennifer and her husband Andrew sat beside Diane, both looking uncharacteristically somber. "Sorry I'm late," I said, taking the empty seat beside Michael. The investor demo ran long. More important than family, I suppose," Jennifer murmured, just loudly enough to be heard. Before I could respond, Robert cleared his throat. "Now that everyone is present, we can discuss the matter at hand." He looked older somehow, the lines around his eyes deeper than I remembered from our last obligatory Sunday dinner. "What's going on, Dad?" Michael asked, his hand finding mine under the table. Robert exchanged glances with Diane, whose perfectly manicured fingers fidgeted with her napkin, another unusual sign. Robert Mitchell made decisions unilaterally. He rarely sought his wife's input, much less her permission. Mitchell Financial Services is facing a significant challenge, he finally said, his voice lacking its usual authoritative resonance. "We've experienced substantial losses due to an investment strategy that did not perform as expected." The table fell silent. In the 4 years I'd known them, I had never heard Robert admit to any professional misstep, let alone a significant challenge. "How substantial are these losses?" Michael asked quietly. Robert's jaw tightened. "Substantial enough that we need to secure new investment within 60 days or face restructuring the entire firm. Which would include," he added, looking pointedly at Jennifer and Andrew, "significant staffing reductions." Jennifer gasped. She had worked at Mitchell Financial since graduating from business school, holding a VP title that everyone knew she hadn't earned. Andrew had joined the firm after marrying Jennifer, receiving a similarly impressive title with equally dubious qualifications. "But that's impossible," Jennifer protested. "Mitchell Financial is rock solid. We have clients whose families have been with us for generations." "Had clients," Diane corrected, taking another sip of her martini. "The Whitmores pulled their entire portfolio last week. The Cabots and Lowells are threatening to do the same." My mind raced, connecting dots. The Whitmores, Cabots, and Lowells were Boston old money, exactly the type of clients Mitchell Financial had served for generations. If they were jumping ship, something catastrophic must have happened. "What exactly was this investment strategy?" I asked, curiosity overcoming my usual reluctance to involve myself in Mitchell business discussions. Robert's expression tightened. Further, but it was Andrew who answered. "Cryptocurrency," he said, unable to meet Robert's eyes. "We advised several major clients to make significant investments in a particular blockchain technology that showed tremendous early promise." I felt my stomach drop. "Let me guess. Evolution chain." Andrew looked up sharply. "How did you know?" Evolution chain had been all over the tech news for the past week. A supposedly revolutionary cryptocurrency that had imploded spectacularly amid allegations of fraud. Early investors had lost billions. "It's my job to know," I said simply. Evolution chains. Technical white paper was riddled with impossibilities that any experienced blockchain developer would have flagged immediately. Robert's face flushed. "If you're suggesting that our due diligence was—" "I'm not suggesting anything," I interrupted, surprising myself with my boldness. "I'm stating a fact. Evolution chain claimed mathematical breakthroughs that defied the laws of computational complexity. It wasn't just high risk, it was mathematically impossible." Andrew stared at his plate. Jennifer's eyes filled with tears. And Robert, confident, commanding Robert Mitchell, seemed to physically deflate before our eyes. "The primary investment was made on Andrew's recommendation," he said, his voice hollow. "The oversight was mine." The admission hung in the air like an explosion frozen in time. Robert Mitchell taking responsibility for a mistake was unprecedented, particularly a mistake that threatened the very foundation of the Mitchell family legacy. Michael squeezed my hand beneath the table. "What's the plan, Dad? There must be options." Robert straightened, some of his natural authority returning. "We're exploring several potential partners for emergency investment. Our name and client list still have considerable value despite this setback." "Who would invest in a firm that just steered its clients into a crypto disaster?" Jennifer asked, mascara beginning to smudge around her eyes. "Legacy financial institutions might," Robert replied, "though they would demand significant control and likely rebrand. The Mitchell name would effectively disappear from the company my grandfather founded." I could see what this was costing him to admit. 3 generations of Mitchell men had built the firm into a Boston institution. Now it might vanish on his watch. "How much investment do you need?" I asked, the question forming before I'd fully processed the implications. Robert named a figure that made Jennifer gasp again. It was enormous, but not, I realized with a start, beyond what Neuraleap could potentially provide, especially after the successful Westbrook demo. "That's impossible," Jennifer said. "No investor would provide that without taking complete control." "That's precisely the situation," Robert confirmed grimly. "We'd be Mitchell in name only, if that." The conversation continued around me, but my mind had shifted into analytical mode, the same state I entered when solving complex technical problems. Neuraleap's recent valuation, our cash reserves, the upcoming Series B funding round. Figures and projections flashed through my consciousness. It was possible. Challenging and risky, but possible. Neuraleap could potentially rescue Mitchell Financial Services. The irony was almost too perfect. For years, the Mitchells had looked down on my work, my little computer project, as Diane once called it. They dismissed neural interfaces as a passing fad, questioned why I'd waste my education on something so speculative, suggested repeatedly that I'd be happier in a more traditional role. And now my little computer project might be the only thing that could save their 3-generation legacy. "Sarah?" Michael's voice broke through my calculations. "You went quiet. What are you thinking?" The entire table turned to look at me, and I realized I had a choice. I could enjoy the schadenfreude of watching the Mitchells' empire crumble under the weight of their own arrogance. Or I could extend a hand, on my terms. "I'm thinking," I said carefully, "that Neuraleap might be in a position to help." The silence that followed was deafening. Robert stared at me like I'd suddenly started speaking in tongues. Diane's martini glass froze halfway to her lips. Jennifer and Andrew exchanged confused glances. "Your startup?" Robert finally managed, infusing the word with the same tone he might use for lemonade stand. "My company," I corrected, firmly. Neuraleap is currently preparing for its Series B funding round. Our valuation after the Series A was significantly higher than projected, and our recent technological breakthroughs have increased investor interest substantially. "You can't be serious," Jennifer said, looking from me to her father. Dad, she makes computer games or something. Neural interfaces, I corrected again, keeping my voice level despite the familiar irritation rising. Our technology helps people with mobility challenges control prosthetics using only their thoughts. We're expanding into non-medical applications, which is driving our valuation growth. Robert studied me with new intensity. For perhaps the first time since I'd met him, he was seeing me not as Michael's unsuitable wife, but as a potential business solution. You believe Neuraleap could provide the necessary investment? He asked, skepticism warring with desperate hope in his voice. It's possible, I replied, careful not to overcommit. I'd need to see your financials, understand exactly what happened, with evolution chain, and assess whether an investment makes sense for my shareholders. But yes, it's within the realm of possibility. Michael was watching me with a mixture of pride and concern. He knew better than anyone what this moment meant. How completely it inverted the power dynamic that had defined my relationship with his family. But he also knew the professional risk such an investment would represent for Neuraleap. This is absurd, Jennifer declared. Dad, you can't seriously be considering this. She knows nothing about financial services. That didn't stop you and Andrew from investing client funds in a fraudulent cryptocurrency, I pointed out, my patience with Jennifer's dismissals finally exhausted. Andrew flinched. Robert's eyes narrowed, but he didn't contradict my assessment. If, and this is a significant if, Neuraleap were to provide emergency investment, I continued, addressing Robert directly, there would be conditions. Of course, he nodded, businessman to businesswoman. We would expect nothing less. I took a deep breath, acutely aware that I was about to challenge the very foundations of Mitchell family authority. First, I would require a controlling interest, not just financially, but operationally. Mitchell Financial Services would need new leadership and a complete overhaul of its investment strategies. Jennifer made a strangled sound. Andrew stared into his wine glass. Diane drained her martini. Second, the firm would need to diversify. Your client base is too homogeneous, too rooted in old money that's shrinking every generation. You need to attract tech wealth, international clients, younger investors planning for futures that look nothing like the past. Robert's expression remained carefully neutral, but I could see his knuckles whitening around his fork. Third, I continued, committed now to laying out my vision, we would integrate Neuraleap's AI-driven analytics into your investment strategies, replacing the subjective, relationship-based approach that led to the evolution chain disaster. The Mitchell dining room had hosted countless important discussions over its century of existence. Business mergers, political strategies, social alliances formed and broken. But I doubted it had ever witnessed anything quite like this. A woman they had consistently underestimated outlining the terms under which she might save their legacy. Robert was silent for a long moment after I finished. Then, with deliberate formality, he nodded. Your terms merit serious consideration. I would like to continue this discussion in a more appropriate setting. Perhaps you could visit the office tomorrow to review our financials? And just like that, I had crossed an invisible threshold. For the first time, Robert Mitchell was addressing me not as Michael's inconvenient wife, but as a business equal worthy of respect, or at least worthy of consideration as the potential savior of Mitchell Financial Services. I'll have my CFO call you in the morning to arrange it, I replied, matching his formality while inwardly marveling at the surreal turn of events. The dinner continued with forced normalcy, though tension vibrated beneath every exchange. Jennifer barely touched, her food shooting daggers at me whenever Robert wasn't looking. Diane ordered a fourth martini, her perfect society matron facade cracking under the strain of watching her husband negotiate with the daughter-in-law she had spent years subtly demeaning. As we prepared to leave, Michael's Aunt Patricia, Patty, to the family, arrived for her weekly dessert visit. Patty was the Mitchell family outlier, the one who had rejected the financial world to become a travel photographer. At 72, she was still jetting around the globe, documenting indigenous cultures and environmental causes. "Well, well," she said, assessing the strained atmosphere with keen eyes. "What did I miss? You all look like someone died." "Just a family discussion about business matters," Robert replied smoothly. Patty raised an eyebrow, clearly unconvinced. "Must have been some discussion. Diane, darling, you look like you've seen a ghost." She turned to me with a genuine smile, the only Mitchell besides Michael who ever seemed truly glad to see me. "Sarah, how's that brilliant company of yours? Still helping people move things with their minds?" "Still going strong," I confirmed, returning her smile. "In fact, we were just discussing a potential collaboration between Neuroleap and Mitchell. Financial." Patty's eyes widened, then crinkled with delight. "Well, it's about damn time this family recognized what a powerhouse you are." Robert always was slow to spot talent outside his narrow financial worldview. She patted her brother's shoulder affectionately, immune to his glare after decades of practice. As Michael and I said our goodbyes, Patty pulled me aside. "Whatever's happening here, I want you to know I'm rooting for you," she whispered. "This family needs shaking up, and you, my dear, are exactly the earthquake they deserve." The drive home was quiet, both of us processing the evening's extraordinary developments. It wasn't until we were back in our condo that Michael finally spoke the question that had clearly been weighing on him. "Are you really considering investing in Dad's firm, after the way they've treated you for years?" I kicked off my heels and sank onto our sofa, suddenly exhausted. "I'm considering it," I admitted. "Not out of any desire to rescue your family legacy, but because there might actually be a solid business case for it." Michael sat beside me, concern evident in his expression. "How so?" "Mitchell Financial does have valuable assets. Their client relationships, their historical performance data, their regulatory approvals, all things that would be expensive and time-consuming for Neuroleap to develop on our own as we expand into fintech." "Fintech?" Michael repeated. "Since when is Neuroleap interested in financial technology?" I smiled, finally sharing the vision I'd been developing privately for months. "Neural interfaces aren't just for medical applications, Michael. The same technology that lets a quadriplegic patient control a robotic arm can help financial analysts process market data more efficiently than any conventional interface. We've been developing prototypes for months." Michael stared at me, amazed. "You never mentioned this." "Because I knew your family would belittle it before understanding it," I said simply. "Just like they've belittled everything else I've done." He nodded, acknowledging the truth of this. "And now?" "Now. They need me more than I need them, which changes everything." I leaned back, closing my eyes. "I haven't decided yet. I'll need to see their financials, understand exactly how deep the evolution chain damage goes. But if it makes business sense for Neuroleap, then yes, I'll do it." "As controlling investor," Michael said, a note of wonder in his voice. "My father taking orders from you, Jennifer reporting to you. I can hardly imagine it." "That's the only way it would work," I replied. "I won't risk Neuroleap's capital without control of how it's used. And honestly, Mitchell Financial Services needs completely new leadership if it has any hope of surviving in the modern financial landscape." Michael was quiet for a moment, processing the implications. "You know they won't make it easy. Dad might be desperate enough to accept your terms now, but he'll fight you for control at every turn. Jennifer will be even worse." "I know," I said, opening my eyes to meet his. "That's why I haven't decided yet. This could be a smart business, move for Neuroleap, or it could be a nightmare of Mitchell family politics that drains resources we need for our core mission. Michael took my hand, his expression serious. Whatever you decide, I'm with you. If you want to let Mitchell Financial sink, I'll support that. If you want to save it on your terms, I'll back you completely, even when it puts me at odds with my family. His unconditional support brought unexpected tears to my eyes. In a family where loyalty was measured in adherence to tradition and fulfillment of expectations, Michael's commitment to our partnership stood in stark contrast. "Thank you," I whispered, squeezing his hand. "I'll decide after I see the numbers tomorrow." As I prepared for bed that night, my phone buzzed with a text from Priya. "How was the urgent Mitchell dinner?" I stared at the screen, trying to formulate a response that could possibly capture the evening's surreal developments. Finally, I typed, "Remember when Diane said my little computer project would never amount to anything? Turns out it might save the entire Mitchell family legacy. Details tomorrow." Priya's response came instantly. "What?" I smiled, setting my phone on the nightstand. Tomorrow would bring hard decisions, complex negotiations, and potentially the most significant pivoting point in both Neuroleap's trajectory and my relationship with the Mitchell family. But tonight, I couldn't help savoring the poetic justice of it all. For years, they had looked down on me, my background, my career, my ambitions. They had dismissed neural interfaces as a passing fascination, suggested repeatedly that I'd be happier in a more suitable role, treated my professional accomplishments as charming hobbies rather than serious work. And now, the very work they had belittled might be the only thing standing between them and financial ruin. As I drifted toward sleep, Aunt Patty's words echoed in my mind. "This family needs shaking up, and you, my dear, are exactly the earthquake they deserve." Tomorrow, the ground beneath Mitchell Financial Services would begin to shift. Whether that shift would strengthen its foundations or bring the entire structure crumbling down remained to be seen. But one thing was certain: nothing would ever be the same again. The Mitchell Financial Services headquarters occupied 6 floors of a historic building in Boston's financial district. I'd been there exactly twice before. Once for an awkward meet-the-family lunch shortly after Michael and I got engaged, and again for Jennifer's promotion celebration. Both visits had been marked by subtle reminders that I was an outsider in their world of old money and established connections. This visit would be different. I arrived 15 minutes early for my 9 a.m. meeting with Robert, dressed in what Priya called my tech CEO armor. A perfectly tailored black suit over a crimson blouse, minimal jewelry, and heels just high enough to be professional without sacrificing mobility. I'd pulled my hair back into a sleek chignon and applied makeup that projected competence rather than attempting to please Mitchell family aesthetics. The receptionist, a young woman I didn't recognize, smiled professionally. "Good morning. How may I help you?" "Sarah Mitchell to see Robert Mitchell. I believe he's expecting me." Recognition flickered across her face at the shared surname. "Of course, Mrs. Mitchell. Mr. Mitchell asked that you be shown directly to the conference room when you arrived. May I get you coffee while you wait?" "Black, please," I replied, noting the subtle shift in her demeanor. The last time I'd been here, I'd been directed to wait in the lobby like any other visitor, despite bearing the Mitchell name. She led me to the main conference room, a wood-paneled space with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the Boston skyline. The massive table could seat 20, though only 3 places had been set with leather portfolios, crystal water glasses, and silver pens bearing the Mitchell Financial Services crest. "Robert will be with you shortly," she said, setting a bone. China cup of coffee before me. Left alone, I took the opportunity to observe the room that had witnessed countless high-stakes negotiations over the decades. Oil paintings of stern-faced Mitchell patriarchs lined the walls, their eyes seeming to follow me accusingly. The oldest, Robert's grandfather, who had founded the firm in 1928, occupied the most prominent position. His expression was particularly forbidding, as if he somehow knew that his legacy now hung in the balance, potentially at the mercy of a woman who built neural interfaces instead of investment portfolios. Admiring the family gallery? I turned to find Robert entering, accompanied by a man I recognized as Gregory Walsh, the firm's chief financial officer. Unlike Robert, who maintained the illusion of calm control despite yesterday's revelations, Gregory looked like he hadn't slept in days, his complexion ashen, his normally immaculate suit slightly rumpled. "Just wondering what your grandfather would think of neural interfaces disrupting financial services," I replied with a small smile. "He'd likely have dismissed them outright," Robert acknowledged, gesturing for me to take a seat. "Though that same resistance to innovation is partly what's brought us to this moment." The admission surprised me. I'd never heard Robert criticize any aspect of Mitchell tradition before. "Sarah, you know Gregory Walsh, our CFO," Robert continued as formal introductions were made. "Ms. Mitchell," Gregory nodded, his expression guarded. "I've followed Neuroleap's progress with interest. Impressive recent valuation." "Thank you," I replied, wondering if he truly had been following my company or if he'd frantically researched it after last night's dinner. Though today, we're here to discuss Mitchell Financial's valuation, not Neuroleap's. Robert cleared his throat. "Before we begin, I want to establish that this conversation falls under strict confidentiality. The situation we're discussing is not yet public knowledge, and premature disclosure could accelerate the very outcome we're trying to prevent." "Of course," I agreed. "I've signed your NDA, and Priya Sharma, my CFO, is the only Neuroleap team member aware of these discussions. She'll need to be brought in if we proceed, but not until we determine whether that's appropriate." Robert nodded, apparently satisfied. "Very well. Gregory has prepared a comprehensive overview of our current situation." For the next 30 minutes, Gregory walked me through a presentation that detailed Mitchell Financial's rapid descent from stability to crisis. The evolution chain investment had been catastrophic, but it was merely the catalyst that exposed deeper structural weaknesses. The firm had been losing younger clients to more tech-savvy competitors for years. Their investment strategies had grown increasingly conservative just as the market rewarded innovation. Several key fund managers had departed for competitors, taking significant client relationships with them. "So the situation is actually worse than you indicated yesterday," I observed when Gregory concluded. Robert's jaw tightened. "The fundamentals are different. We're not just facing a temporary liquidity challenge due to the evolution chain losses. We're confronting an existential threat to our business model." I studied the projected financials. On the screen, the analytical part of my mind already separating salvageable assets from liabilities. "Who made the initial evolution chain recommendation?" I asked. "You mentioned Andrew was involved, but I'd like to understand the entire decision chain." Robert and Gregory exchanged glances. "Andrew brought the opportunity to our attention," Robert said carefully. "But the ultimate investment decision was made collectively by our strategy committee." "Which you chair," I noted. "And which includes Jennifer and 3 other Mitchell family members, if I recall correctly." Gregory shifted uncomfortably. "That's correct. So no one with actual cryptocurrency expertise was consulted before investing client funds in a mathematically impossible blockchain concept?" Robert's expression hardened. "If you're here merely to criticize decisions already made..." "I'm here to understand how those decisions were made," I interrupted, "because that directly impacts whether an investment from Neuroleap makes any sense. If the underlying decision-making structures remain unchanged, then throwing good money after bad would be irresponsible." The silence that followed was heavy with tension. I had just articulated what neither man wanted to acknowledge, that Mitchell Financial's problems went far beyond a single bad investment. The firm's governance was fundamentally flawed, prioritizing family control over expertise and innovation. "What would you suggest?" Robert finally asked, his tone carefully neutral. "A complete overhaul," I replied without hesitation. "The strategy committee needs independent members with relevant expertise. Investment decisions need to be driven by data and analysis, not relationships and instinct. The firm's technology infrastructure requires modernization, and your client acquisition strategy needs to expand beyond Boston's established families." I paused, then added the most difficult truth. "And the Mitchell family's role needs to be redefined. You can remain the face of the firm for legacy clients who value that connection, but operational control would need to shift to those best qualified, regardless of last name." Robert's expression remained impassive, but a muscle worked in his jaw, the only visible sign of the internal struggle I knew he must be experiencing. For 3 generations, Mitchell Financial had operated as a family fiefdom, with major decisions made around dining tables rather than boardroom tables. What I was proposing wasn't just a financial restructuring. It was a complete reimagining of the Mitchell family's relationship to their legacy. "You've given this considerable thought," he said finally. "I've been watching your firm's trajectory for 4 years," I replied honestly. Not because I expected to ever have a voice in its operations, but because understanding Mitchell Financial was necessary to understanding my husband's family dynamics. Gregory cleared his throat. "Ms. Mitchell, while your analysis has merit, the timeline we're facing doesn't allow for gradual restructuring. We need immediate capital infusion to stabilize client confidence and prevent further withdrawals." "I understand the urgency," I assured him, "but my terms would have to be accepted before any investment. Neuroleap won't provide emergency funding without guarantee of fundamental change." Robert leaned forward, his demeanor shifting from defensive to pragmatic. "Let's assume, for the sake of discussion, that we accept your general framework. What specifically would an investment from Neuroleap look like? Structure, amount, timeline?" I outlined my preliminary thinking, a combination of direct investment and technology integration that would fundamentally transform Mitchell Financial, while preserving certain elements of its heritage. Neuroleap's neural interface technology would be adapted for financial analytics, creating a proprietary system that could potentially recapture the competitive edge the firm had lost. Essentially, I concluded, Mitchell Financial would become a testbed for applying neural interface technology to financial services, an entirely new market vertical for Neuroleap, and a desperately needed innovation for your firm. For the first time since I'd entered the room, I saw genuine interest in Robert's expression. Not just the desperate hope of someone seeking rescue, but the calculated assessment of a businessman recognizing potential value. "The integration of your technology could indeed create a unique market position," he acknowledged, "though the cultural shift required would be significant." "Seismic," I corrected gently. "The Mitchell Financial Services that emerges from this process would honor its heritage while operating fundamentally differently. Some current team members would likely find the transition challenging, if not impossible." We all knew I was referring to Jennifer and Andrew, though politeness prevented naming them directly. "I'll need to discuss this with the board," Robert said after a thoughtful pause. "And with the family. Jennifer and Andrew have dedicated their careers to Mitchell Financial. Their perspectives must be considered." I stood, gathering my materials. "Of course, but remember that time is working against you. If news of the evolution chain losses becomes public before you secure new investment, the client exodus will accelerate beyond recovery." Robert extended his hand, his grip firm despite the strain evident in his features. "We'll reconvene tomorrow morning. I'll have an answer regarding your proposed framework by then." As I exited the Mitchell Financial building, I felt strangely unsettled. I had entered that conference room expecting resistance, defensiveness, perhaps even hostility. Instead, Robert had shown unexpected adaptability, a willingness to at least consider radical change to save the family legacy. It was a side of My father-in-law I'd never glimpsed in 4 years of family dinners and holiday gatherings. Back at Neuroleap, Priya was waiting in my office, practically vibrating with curiosity. Well, is Mitchell Financial really on the verge of collapse? And are you seriously considering investing? I closed the door before filling her in on the morning's revelations. As my co-founder and closest friend, Priya was the only person besides Michael with whom I could be completely transparent about both the business and personal dimensions of the situation. They're in worse shape than they admitted at dinner, I concluded. The evolution chain disaster was just the tipping point for systemic problems they've been ignoring for years. Priya whistled low. And you're actually considering riding to the rescue? After the way they've treated you? I'm considering a strategic acquisition that could accelerate our entry into fintech by years, I corrected. The fact that it happens to involve the Mitchell family is secondary. Is it, though? Priya raised an eyebrow skeptically. Because from where I'm sitting, there's a certain poetic justice to this whole scenario that seems to be influencing. You're thinking. I sighed, sinking into my chair. Priya knew me too well. Fine. I won't pretend there isn't satisfaction in the role reversal. But I wouldn't risk Neuroleap's capital or our team's focus on a personal vendetta. This only makes sense if it genuinely advances our business objectives. And does it? Priya asked, her expression turning serious. We've discussed diversifying into fintech, but not through acquisition of a troubled legacy firm with cultural baggage and a cryptocurrency scandal hanging over it. It's high risk, I admitted. But their client relationships, regulatory approvals, and institutional knowledge would be extremely valuable as we expand our neural interface applications beyond healthcare. The alternative is building a financial services division from scratch, which would take years and millions in investment. Priya nodded slowly. Send me the financials. I'll run the numbers and give you my unvarnished opinion by morning. She paused at the door. Just promise me one thing? What's that? If we do this, I get to be in the room when Jennifer realizes she's reporting to you. Her grin was impish. After all the snide comments she's made about your cute little startup over the years, that moment deserves documentation. I laughed despite the gravity of the situation. I promise. That evening, I arrived home to find Michael in the kitchen, cooking what appeared to be his signature stress relief meal, an elaborate pasta dish that required constant attention and precise timing. Cooking had become his therapy during our early dating years, when the pressure of breaking Mitchell family tradition had weighed heaviest. That bad, huh? I asked, setting my laptop bag on the counter and kissing his cheek. Jennifer called. 4 times. He stirred the sauce with more vigor than necessary. Apparently, you're staging a hostile takeover of the family business. I raised an eyebrow. Interesting interpretation of considering investment at their request. She's convinced you're exploiting a temporary setback to seize control of Mitchell Financial and systematically destroy the family legacy. Temporary. Setback? I echoed incredulously. Michael, they're weeks away from massive layoffs and possible bankruptcy, and my conditions would preserve the Mitchell legacy just with actual competent management. Michael's expression softened. I know that. Dad knows that too, I think. But Jennifer and Mom have constructed a narrative where you're the villain exploiting a crisis, not the potential savior responding to their request for help. I poured myself a glass of wine from the open bottle on the counter. Not surprising. It's easier to cast me as an opportunistic outsider than acknowledge their own role in creating this situation. The sauce bubbled aggressively, and Michael reduced the heat with practiced precision. Jennifer also mentioned that Andrew feels you were unnecessarily harsh in your assessment of his evolution chain recommendation. Andrew recommended investing client funds in a mathematically impossible cryptocurrency scheme without consulting anyone with relevant expertise. I replied flatly. My assessment was restrained compared to what the SEC might say when they inevitably investigate. Michael winced. You think it will come to that? Almost certainly. The losses are too significant to escape regulatory scrutiny. I took a sip of wine, watching him process this additional complication. Michael, I need to know where you stand in all this. If Neuroleap invests in Mitchell Financial, I'll become the de facto head of your family's business. That will change our dynamics with your family in ways we can't fully anticipate. He was quiet for a moment, focusing on plating our dinner with meticulous attention. When he finally looked up, his expression was resolute. I stand with you, he said simply. I always have. When I walked away from Mitchell Financial to pursue psychology, it was because I needed to build a life based on my own values, not family expectations. You've done the same with Neuroleap, creating something meaningful on your own terms. He placed our plates on the dining table, then took my hands in his. If saving the family business aligns with your vision for Neuroleap, I support that. Completely. If the terms aren't right and you walk away, I support that too. But I won't let my family manipulate or pressure you either way. The conviction in his voice brought unexpected tears to my eyes. In a family system built on obligation and tradition, Michael's commitment to our partnership stood in stark contrast. Thank you, I said softly. That means everything. We ate dinner discussing lighter topics, deliberately setting aside Mitchell family drama for an hour of normalcy. But as we cleared the dishes, my phone buzzed with a text from an unexpected source, Robert Mitchell. Jennifer has raised significant concerns about your proposed framework. Diane suggests we discuss over breakfast tomorrow, 8 a.m. at the house. Just family. I showed Michael the message, watching his expression darken. Just family means they want to pressure you without witnesses, he observed. Classic Mitchell strategy when closing ranks against an outside threat. Which apparently includes me, despite bearing the Mitchell name for 4 years. Michael's jaw tightened. We don't have to go. You can insist on keeping these discussions professional. Conference room, not breakfast table. I considered this, weighing the business and personal dimensions of the situation. No, let's go. If they want to frame this as a family matter rather than a business negotiation, I can work with that. I smiled grimly. After all, family speaks truth to family, right? This isn't what I had in mind, Michael muttered, but I could see. He understood my reasoning. I texted Robert back, "We'll be there." The Mitchell family home looked different in morning light, less intimidating, more clearly showing its age in subtle ways. Peeling paint near the roofline, slightly uneven front steps, tarnish beginning to dull the brass door fixtures. Small, imperfections that would have been immediately addressed in more prosperous times. Even Mitchell Financial's troubles were written on the facade of the family home, if one knew where to look. Henderson greeted us with his usual formal nod, though I detected a new wariness in his manner. Word of the family crisis had clearly permeated even to the household staff. "They're in the morning room," he informed us, taking our coats. The wee morning room was a sun-filled space overlooking the garden, used for casual family breakfasts and informal gatherings. I'd always found it the most comfortable room in the Mitchell house, the only space that felt designed for living rather than impressing. Today, however, the atmosphere was anything but comfortable. Robert and Diane sat at one end of the table, Jennifer and Andrew at the other. All conversation ceased abruptly as we entered. "Michael, Sarah," Robert nodded. "Thank you for coming." Michael's hand found the small of my back, a subtle gesture of support as we took the 2 remaining seats. The table had been set with Diane's grandmother's china, a detail that wasn't lost on me. The Mitchells deployed family heirlooms strategically, using physical reminders of heritage to reinforce tradition during moments of change or conflict. Jennifer has expressed concerns about the direction of our discussions yesterday. Robert began once Henderson had served coffee and withdrawn. I thought it prudent to address these as a family before proceeding further. Jennifer's expression was tight, her eyes overbright with emotion or lack of sleep, possibly both. "I think we need to be clear about what's happening here," she said, her voice strained. "Sarah is attempting to leverage a temporary financial setback to fundamentally alter the nature of Mitchell Financial Services." "That's one interpretation," I replied evenly. "Another would be that Mitchell Financial Services is facing an existential crisis, and I'm considering risking my company's capital to prevent its collapse, but only under conditions that address the underlying structural problems." "Structural problems?" Jennifer's laugh held an edge of hysteria. "We've been operating successfully for nearly a century. One investment misstep doesn't invalidate our entire approach." "One catastrophic investment misstep," I corrected, gently, "on top of declining market share, outdated technology infrastructure, and governance that prioritizes family control over expertise." I turned to Robert. "These aren't just my observations. They're reflected in your own financial projections, which show a downward trajectory preceding the evolution chain losses." Robert didn't contradict me, though his expression remained carefully neutral. Diane, however, set down her coffee cup with a sharp click against the saucer. "This isn't just about business," she said, addressing me directly for the first time. "This is about family legacy. The Mitchell name has stood for financial excellence for generations. What you're proposing would effectively end that tradition." "What I'm proposing would evolve that tradition," I countered. "The alternative is watching it collapse entirely." Michael cleared his throat. "Mom, Dad, Jennifer, Sarah isn't your enemy here. She's offering a potential solution to a crisis that exists regardless of her involvement. If you reject her terms, you'll still need to find investment elsewhere, likely on even less favorable terms." Andrew, who had remained silent until now, finally spoke. "The cryptocurrency market is volatile by nature. Evolution Chain's collapse was an anomaly, not a reflection on our investment strategy. Given time, we can recover without surrendering control of the firm." I turned to him, unable to mask my incredulity. "Evolution Chain wasn't an anomaly, Andrew. It was a predictable failure based on fundamental mathematical impossibilities in its technical design. Any due diligence involving actual blockchain, experts would have flagged it immediately." Andrew flushed. "We conducted thorough due diligence." "With whom?" I interrupted. "Because I've reviewed the materials Gregory provided, and there's no evidence that anyone with technical cryptocurrency expertise was consulted before Mitchell Financial invested client funds." The silence that followed confirmed my suspicion. Andrew had championed Evolution Chain based on social connections and surface-level understanding, not rigorous analysis. And the Mitchell family's strategy committee, including Robert and Jennifer, had approved it without seeking independent technical validation. "This is precisely the governance failure I referenced yesterday," I continued more gently. "Investment decisions being made based on relationships and instinct rather than expertise and analysis. It's an approach that might have worked in the 1980s, but it's dangerously inadequate in today's financial landscape." Robert's expression had grown increasingly troubled as I spoke. "Sarah makes a valid point regarding our due diligence processes," he admitted, surprising everyone at the table. "The Evolution Chain situation has exposed weaknesses in our governance that must be addressed, regardless of how we proceed." Jennifer stared at her father in disbelief. "Dad, you can't seriously be considering handing control of our family's legacy to—" She cut herself off, but the implication hung in the air. "To your brother's wife?" I finished for her. "To someone who built a successful technology company from nothing? To someone whose expertise in emerging technologies might have prevented the very crisis you're now facing?" I kept my tone measured, despite the anger flaring inside me. "Please, Jennifer, complete your thought." Michael's hand found mine beneath the table, a silent show of support as tension crackled around us. Diane intervened, her social instincts for deflecting conflict kicking in. "What Sarah means, Jennifer, is that we should focus on solutions rather than personalities. We all want what's best for Mitchell Financial. Do we? Jennifer challenged, her composure finally cracking. Because from where I sit, it looks like Sarah has been waiting for an opportunity like this. A chance to take control after years of being treated as an outsider. Jennifer! Michael's voice held a warning edge I rarely heard. I squeezed his hand, then addressed Jennifer directly. I understand why you might see it that way. The power dynamic between us has shifted overnight, and that's uncomfortable. But this isn't about settling scores. It's about whether Neuroleap's neural interface technology and capital investment can create a viable future for Mitchell Financial Services. And if we reject your terms? Andrew asked stiffly. What then? Then I wish you luck finding alternative investment on better terms, I replied honestly. But understand that any investor with due diligence capabilities will identify the same structural issues I've outlined. The choice isn't between my conditions and maintaining the status quo. It's between my conditions and potentially more severe external control or liquidation. Robert had been watching this exchange with an unreadable expression. Now he straightened, assuming the authoritative posture I'd seen him use when closing difficult negotiations. I believe we've aired the primary concerns, he said, effectively ending the debate. Sarah, Michael, thank you for coming. The family needs to discuss these matters privately before we proceed further. It was a dismissal, polite but firm. Michael and I rose, thanking Diane for breakfast with the ingrained social courtesy that Mitchell family gatherings demanded, regardless of underlying tension. As we reached the door, Robert spoke again. Sarah, regardless of how these discussions conclude, I want to acknowledge the professionalism you've brought to a difficult situation. It reflects well on you and on Neuroleap. Coming from Robert, Mitchell, this qualified as effusive praise. I nodded my acknowledgement, not trusting myself to respond without betraying the complex emotions swirling beneath my professional demeanor. In the car, Michael exhaled slowly, the tension of the morning visibly draining from his shoulders. Well, that was brutal. But necessary, I replied, starting the engine. They needed to confront the reality of their situation directly, not through Gregory's sanitized presentations. Jennifer looked ready to implode when Dad complimented you. I smiled despite myself. Small victories. Do you think they'll accept your terms? I considered this as we pulled away from the Mitchell family home, the imposing structure receding in the rearview mirror. Robert will. He's pragmatic enough to recognize there are no better options. Jennifer and Andrew will fight it to the bitter end. Diane will ultimately side with Robert while maintaining plausible deniability with Jennifer. I glanced at Michael. That's been the Mitchell family dynamic for as long as I've known them. Why would it change now? Michael was quiet for a moment, watching the familiar streets of his childhood pass by. Because everything else is changing, he said finally. The financial foundation of the Mitchell identity is crumbling. The power structure that's defined family relationships for decades is inverting. In that context, maybe even the most entrenched dynamics can shift. His observation was insightful, reminding me once again why I'd fallen in love with this particular Mitchell who saw family systems with such clarity. Maybe you're right, I conceded, though I'm not holding my breath for a group hug and tearful reconciliation. Michael laughed, the sound lightening the mood. God, no. We're still Mitchells. The most we can hope for is passive-aggressive acceptance, followed by years of subtle undermining comments at holiday gatherings. Now, that sounds like the family I married into. I grinned. My phone rang through the car's Bluetooth system. Priya calling from Neuroleap. Tell me you haven't signed anything yet, she said without preamble when I answered. Good morning to you too, I replied, exchanging concerned glances with Michael. What's wrong? I've been going through Mitchell Financial's detailed financials all night, Priya explained, her voice tight with urgency. Sarah, there's something they're not telling you about the evolution chain situation, something that changes everything. The tone of her voice sent a cold shiver down my spine. I'm on my way to the office, I said. Don't discuss this over the phone. After ending the call, I accelerated, my mind racing with possibilities. What could be worse than what Mitchell Financial had already disclosed? What additional complication had they concealed, even as they sought my investment? And most troublingly, if Priya had discovered it during one night of financial analysis, why hadn't Mitchell Financial's own team identified the issue? Or had they? Michael's expression had grown serious. You think they're deliberately hiding something? I don't know, I admitted, but I intend to find out. As we sped toward Neuroleap's Cambridge office, the Mitchell family breakfast receded from my thoughts, replaced by a growing sense of foreboding. Whatever Priya had discovered threatened to complicate an already fraught situation, potentially transforming a difficult business decision into something far more complex and consequential. The ground beneath Mitchell Financial Services wasn't just shifting. It might be crumbling completely. The tension in my office was palpable as Priya spread financial documents across my desk. Her usual calm efficiency had been replaced by barely contained agitation, dark circles under her eyes testifying to her sleepless night spent unraveling Mitchell Financial's secrets. It's not just about evolution chain, she said, pointing to a series of highlighted transactions. That was bad enough, but it's just the tip of the iceberg. Michael leaned forward in his chair, brow furrowed. What are we looking at exactly? Priya looked to me for permission to speak freely in front of him. I nodded. Michael needed to hear this, regardless of how it might affect his perception of his family. Mitchell Financial created a separate investment vehicle, technically a different legal entity, to make certain high-risk investments, Priya explained, including but not limited to evolution chain. The structure was designed to shield the main firm from potential losses. That's not uncommon in financial services, I noted, though unease was already building. What makes this problematic? Several things, Priya replied grimly. First, the disclosure to clients was minimal, bordering on non-existent. Their standard investment agreements include a clause allowing allocation to alternative investment strategies, but with no clear indication of risk levels or the separate entity structure. Michael frowned. Is that legal? Technically, perhaps. Ethically, absolutely not, Priya said. But here's the real bombshell. When Evolution Chain collapsed, Mitchell Financial should have isolated the losses to that separate vehicle. Instead, there's evidence they've been shifting assets between entities to obscure the full extent of the damage. I felt a cold weight settling in my stomach. Are you saying they're committing fraud? I'm saying the lines between legal entities have been deliberately blurred in ways that regulatory authorities would find extremely concerning, Priya replied carefully. Whether it constitutes fraud would be for investigators and prosecutors to determine. Michael had gone pale. Who would have authorized this? My father? Priya hesitated, then pointed to a series of transaction approvals. Each bore a familiar signature. Jennifer Mitchell Peterson. Jennifer is listed as the primary authorized signatory on these intercompany transfers, she explained quietly. Though given her position in the firm's hierarchy, it's unlikely she acted without senior approval. Michael stared at his sister's signature, disbelief written across his features. I reached for his hand, offering silent support as he processed this new information. There's more, Priya continued reluctantly. The timing and nature of certain transfers suggests they were attempting to temporarily shore up financial positions during scheduled audits and client reviews. Window dressing, I murmured, the industry term for temporarily adjusting holdings to appear stronger during reporting periods. Exactly, Priya nodded. But taken together with the inadequate disclosures, And the commingling of supposedly separate entities, it creates a pattern that goes beyond aggressive accounting. I sat back, mind racing. This changed everything. Neuroleap couldn't invest in Mitchell Financial without becoming entangled in potential regulatory violations. Even if we structured the investment as a complete ownership change with new management, the legal exposure would be enormous. Why wouldn't they disclose this to us? I wondered aloud. Surely they realized we'd discover it during due diligence. Maybe they're desperate enough to hope you wouldn't look too closely, Priya suggested. Or that family loyalty would outweigh professional judgment. Michael stood abruptly, turning to stare out the window at the Cambridge skyline. His shoulders were rigid with tension, hands clenched at his sides. "Michael?" I prompted gently. "There has to be an explanation," he said, voice tight. "Dad wouldn't knowingly authorize fraud. And Jennifer, she can be difficult, but she's not dishonest." I exchanged glances with Priya, who gathered her materials and quietly excused herself. Giving us privacy, "Michael," I said once the door closed, "people make different choices when they're desperate, when they feel their legacy slipping away." He turned, his expression pained. "You think they knew exactly what they were doing?" It wasn't a question, but I answered anyway. "I think they convinced themselves it was temporary, just moving things around until the markets recovered, until client confidence returned, until the evolution chain disaster could be absorbed. The problem with that kind of thinking is that it's a slippery slope. Each adjustment requires another, then another." Michael ran a hand through his hair, a gesture so reminiscent of his father that it startled me. "What happens now?" I considered my options carefully. The businesswoman in me wanted to walk away immediately, severing all connection to a potentially toxic investment. But this wasn't just business. This was family. Michael's family. People whose decisions affected him regardless of his direct involvement. First, we need to understand exactly what happened, I decided. I'm going to call Robert and request a meeting, with him alone. No Gregory, no Jennifer, just the head of the family. And then? I met his gaze directly. Then we determine whether there's any path forward that doesn't compromise Neuroleap or our personal integrity. I made the call from my office with Michael sitting opposite me. Robert's secretary initially tried to defer me to later in the week, but when I mentioned urgent regulatory concerns, she quickly transferred me. "Sarah," Robert answered, his tone carefully neutral. "I wasn't expecting to hear from you so soon after our family discussion this morning." "This isn't about family dynamics," I replied. "It's about significant irregularities in Mitchell Financial's handling of the evolution chain situation. Irregularities with potential regulatory implications." A long silence followed, during which I could almost hear Robert recalculating his position. When he finally spoke, his voice had lost its practiced smoothness. "I see. Perhaps we should discuss this in person." "My office," I insisted. 4 o'clock today?" It wasn't a request. Another pause, then, "Very well." As I hung up, Michael was watching me with a mixture of admiration and apprehension. "He agreed to come here? To your territory?" "He doesn't have much choice," I pointed out. "The power dynamic has shifted even further than we realized this morning." "What are you hoping to accomplish?" Michael asked, concern evident in his voice. "If what Priya found is accurate, this goes beyond business problems. There could be legal consequences." I nodded, acknowledging the gravity of the situation. "I know. That's exactly why we need to understand who knew what and when, before anything else happens." The hours until Robert's arrival passed in a blur of preparation. I had Priya compile the most concerning transactions into a clear presentation, while our legal counsel provided preliminary analysis of potential regulatory issues. Michael withdrew to the small meditation room we maintained for employees, needing space to process the implications for his family. At precisely 4 o'clock, Henderson announced Robert's arrival. I'd never seen my father-in-law in our Cambridge office before. He looked distinctly out of place among the exposed brick walls, open workspaces, and casual tech atmosphere. His immaculate suit and rigid posture marked him as a visitor from another professional world. "Thank you for coming," I greeted him, shaking his hand professionally before leading him to my private conference room. No ostentatious mahogany table here, just a simple glass surface with ergonomic chairs and state-of-the-art presentation. Technology built seamlessly into the environment. Robert took the offered seat, his expression guarded. "Your message sounded urgent. I assume you found something concerning in our financials." "More than concerning," I replied, activating the wall display with a gesture. The first slide appeared, a visual representation of Mitchell Financial's official structure alongside the shadow investment vehicle Priya had identified. "I need you to explain this." For a moment, Robert simply stared at the display, his face impassive. Then, almost imperceptibly, his shoulders sagged. "How much do you know?" he asked quietly. "Enough to understand that Mitchell Financial has been operating in regulatory gray areas at best, and potentially committing outright securities violations at worst," I answered. "What I don't know is why, or who authorized these decisions." Robert's eyes flicked to the closed door. "Is Michael here?" "He's in the building, but not part of this conversation. This is between you and me, CEO to CEO." Robert nodded, seeming to appreciate the framing. The separate investment vehicle, Beacon Capital Partners, was established 7 years ago, initially for legitimate purposes. Certain clients wanted exposure to higher-risk investments without affecting their core portfolios. The structure was reviewed by our legal team and properly disclosed at the time. "But," I prompted, "but over time, its purpose evolved," he admitted. As traditional investment returns diminished in the low-interest environment, we faced increasing pressure to deliver performance. Beacon became a way to pursue more aggressive strategies without alarming conservative clients or triggering risk assessment protocols at the main firm, including cryptocurrency investments like Evolution Chain, I noted. Robert nodded. Andrew brought the opportunity to Jennifer, who saw it as a potential game changer. The projected returns were extraordinary and mathematically impossible, I reminded him. But that's not the central issue here. When Evolution Chain collapsed, proper segregation should have contained the losses to Beacon and its direct investors. Instead, there's clear evidence of asset commingling and artificial transactions to obscure the damage. Who authorized that? Robert was silent for a long moment, conflict evident in his expression. I realized he was weighing family loyalty against self-preservation, calculating how much responsibility to claim personally versus allowing blame to fall on Jennifer and Andrew. The initial response was panic, he finally said. Evolution Chain's collapse was sudden and complete. Beacon's liquidity was instantly compromised, with client redemption requests we couldn't fulfill. Jennifer authorized temporary asset transfers from Mitchell Financial to meet immediate obligations. With your knowledge? I pressed. With my tacit understanding that extraordinary measures were being taken, he replied carefully. I didn't review the specific transactions. Plausible deniability, I observed, not bothering to hide my disappointment. You permitted your daughter to take actions that could constitute securities fraud, while maintaining enough distance to claim ignorance if discovered. Robert flinched at the word fraud, but didn't contradict me. The intention was to reverse the transfers once markets stabilized, to treat it as a temporary liquidity solution, not a permanent commingling of assets. But markets didn't stabilize, I pointed out. The crypto contagion spread, other positions deteriorated, and what began as temporary became increasingly permanent. Now you're facing both a genuine financial crisis and potential regulatory investigation if these practices are discovered. Robert's expression confirmed my assessment. The situation escalated beyond our control. And that's why you're seeking outside investment so urgently, I concluded. Not just to shore up client confidence, but to infuse enough capital to unwind these problematic transactions before regulators or auditors identify them. Among other considerations, yes, he admitted. I leaned forward, holding his gaze. Robert, did you understand that by involving Neuroleap, you were potentially making us complicit in resolving irregularities that might interest the SEC? His hesitation told me everything. I had hoped that with sufficient capital, the technical issues could be addressed before any investment was finalized. Technical issues, I repeated, unable to keep the edge from my voice. That's quite a euphemism for what could potentially involve criminal charges. Robert's face hardened. No one has committed any crime. Aggressive accounting in a crisis situation is hardly unprecedented in financial services. Call it what you want, I replied. But Neuroleap cannot and will not invest in Mitchell Financial under these circumstances. The legal exposure would be unacceptable, not to mention the ethical implications. For the first time since I'd known him, Robert Mitchell looked genuinely lost. The carefully constructed facade of confident authority had crumbled, revealing an aging man watching his life's work collapse around him. "What do you intend to do with this information?" he asked, his voice barely audible. It was the question I'd been dreading, the one that forced me to balance business judgment, family loyalty, and ethical responsibility. Neuroleap had no legal obligation to report Mitchell Financial's practices to regulators, but we had discovered potential securities violations that might harm investors and clients who trusted the Mitchell name. That depends, I said carefully, on what happens next. What options remain? Robert asked, a hint of his familiar pragmatism returning. If investment from Neuroleap is off the table, investment in the current Mitchell Financial structure is impossible, I clarified. But there might be alternatives that preserve client relationships, key personnel, and elements of the Mitchell legacy without the legal baggage. Robert's eyes narrowed slightly. What kind of alternatives? A new entity, I explained. Neuroleap could establish a financial services division that acquires Mitchell Financial's client relationships, key employees, and intellectual property, but not the legal entities themselves. The existing Mitchell Financial and Beacon would need to be wound down properly, with full disclosure to regulators about past practices. That would mean admitting the irregularities, Robert noted, his expression darkening. Potentially triggering investigations, penalties. Yes, I acknowledged. There would be consequences, but they would fall on the corporate entities, not necessarily on individuals, if the disclosure is handled properly and proactively. And the Mitchell name, the legacy, could continue in a restructured form, I suggested, but with transparent governance and proper regulatory compliance from day one. No separate vehicles, no hidden risks, no asset shuffling. Robert was silent, absorbing the implications. I could almost see him calculating the personal and professional costs against the alternative, watching Mitchell Financial collapse completely, with even greater regulatory scrutiny inevitable once desperate clients began filing complaints. Jennifer would never accept this arrangement, he said finally. Nor would Andrew. Perhaps not, I conceded. But the alternative is worse. Complete collapse, public scandal, possible securities investigations triggered by angry clients. At least this approach offers a path to preserve something meaningful from 3 generations of work. Robert stood abruptly, moving to the window that overlooked the Cambridge Innovation District. The contrast couldn't have been more stark, his traditional banking world literally facing the future of technology and finance. I need to discuss this with my family, he said at last, and with our legal counsel. Of course, I agreed. But understand that time is critical. If Mitchell Financial's practices come to light through other channels before a controlled disclosure, all options narrow considerably. He turned back to me, studying my face with new intensity. Why would you offer even this much? After the way we've treated you all these years, you could simply walk away and let the consequences unfold. The question caught me off guard with its unexpected self-awareness. I answered honestly. Partly for Michael. Your family's disgrace would affect him regardless of his distance from the firm. Partly for the innocent employees and clients who would be harmed. And partly, I added, surprising myself, because despite everything, I believe in redemption, in the possibility that even flawed legacies can be transformed into something better. Robert's expression softened almost imperceptibly. I underestimated you from the beginning. We all did. Yes, I agreed simply. You did. He straightened his shoulders, formal mask sliding back into place. I'll be in touch tomorrow with our decision. Thank you for the courtesy of this private conversation. After he left, I remained in the conference room, processing the enormity of what had just transpired. The Mitchell family's carefully constructed world was crumbling, had been crumbling for longer than anyone realized. And somehow, improbably, I had become their last hope for salvaging anything from the wreckage. Michael found me there, standing at the same window where his father had contemplated the tech landscape just minutes earlier. How bad is it? He asked quietly. I turned to face him. Worse than we thought. Jennifer authorized transactions. That blurred the lines between entities after Evolution Chain collapsed. Your father maintained plausible deniability, but tacitly permitted it. Michael closed his eyes briefly, absorbing the blow. So there's no way forward for Neuroleap's investment. Not in Mitchell Financial as it currently exists, I confirmed. But I've proposed an alternative, creating a new entity that would acquire client relationships and key personnel, while leaving the problematic legal structures behind. And the regulatory issues would require disclosure and likely penalties, I said gently. But handled properly, with voluntary cooperation, the consequences could be contained primarily to the corporations rather than individuals. Michael nodded slowly, processing the implications. My father agreed to consider this? He's discussing it with the family. We'll know tomorrow. Michael moved to stand beside me at the window, both of us looking out at the city skyline as afternoon faded toward evening. Whatever happens, he said quietly, thank you for trying to find a solution. You could have just walked away. I leaned against him, drawing strength from his steady presence. Walking away might have been simpler, but I'm not sure I could have lived with myself, knowing there was a potential path forward that I didn't offer. My phone vibrated with an incoming text. I glanced down, surprised to see Jennifer's name on the screen. We need to talk. Without my father. Without Michael. Just us. I showed Michael the message, watching his expression shift from surprise to wariness. That can't be good. Or maybe it is, I countered. Maybe she's ready to take responsibility, to help find a constructive solution. Michael's skeptical look said everything about how likely he considered that scenario. You're not meeting her alone. Actually, I think I am, I replied. This might be our best chance to break through the family dynamics and get to actual solutions. Sarah, I'll meet her in public, I assured him. The cafe on the ground floor of our building. Plenty of witnesses, security cameras, no danger of anything unprofessional. He still looked unconvinced, but nodded reluctantly. When? I texted Jennifer back. Ground floor cafe of the Neuroleap building, 6 p.m. today. Her reply came instantly. I'll be there. Michael insisted on walking me to the cafe, though he agreed to leave before Jennifer arrived. Text me when you're finished, he said, kissing my cheek before departing. And remember that Jennifer has always been the most volatile Mitchell. I chose a table with good visibility, ordered herbal tea to calm my nerves, and waited. Jennifer arrived precisely at 6, punctuality being a non-negotiable Mitchell family trait. She looked different than she had at breakfast, her usual polished perfection replaced by visible strain. Her makeup couldn't quite conceal the redness around her eyes, and her typically immaculate hair showed signs of hasty styling. "Thank you for meeting me," she said stiffly, sliding into the seat opposite mine. "Of course," I replied, studying her carefully. "Would you like something? The lavender tea is surprisingly good." She shook her head impatiently. "I'm not here for tea. I'm here because my father just informed us of your alternative proposal." I waited, letting her take the conversation where she needed to. "He seems to think it's our only viable option," she continued, a slight tremor in her voice betraying her emotional state. "Dismantle Mitchell Financial, create some new hybrid with your tech company, and accept whatever penalties regulators impose for past irregularities. It's one potential path forward," I confirmed. "The alternative is continuing on the high, current trajectory, which leads to collapse and likely worse regulatory consequences when everything comes to light through client complaints." Jennifer's eyes flashed. "You make it sound so simple. Just sacrifice 3 generations of Mitchell legacy to save what? Our personal reputations?" "To save client relationships built over decades," I corrected gently. "To preserve jobs for employees who had nothing to do with the evolution chain disaster or its aftermath. To transform something meaningful from what would otherwise be total loss." "Under your control," she noted bitterly. "With the Mitchell name subordinate to your tech startup." I set down my teacup carefully. "Jennifer, I understand this is painful. Your identity, your career, your family history, they're all tied to Mitchell Financial in its current form. But that form has become unsustainable, not because of my involvement, but because of decisions made long before I entered the picture." She flinched, looking away. For a moment, I glimpsed vulnerability beneath her defensive hostility, the fear of someone watching their carefully constructed world collapse. "My father says you identified specific transactions," she said finally, her voice barely audible. "Transfers between entities that shouldn't have happened." "Yes. And you know I authorized them." I nodded, watching her carefully. "What you don't know," she continued, meeting my eyes directly for perhaps the first time in our relationship, "is that I had no choice. When Evolution Chain collapsed, we faced immediate redemption demands from Beacon investors. There was no liquidity, none. If we didn't transfer assets temporarily, the entire structure would have imploded within days." "I understand the pressure you were under," I acknowledged, "but temporary measures became permanent, and each additional transfer made the situation worse, not better." Jennifer's composure cracked slightly. "I know that now, but at the time, it seemed like our only option. Andrew was falling apart. Dad was focused on maintaining client confidence in the main firm. I was left trying to hold everything together with increasingly desperate measures." The raw emotion in her voice surprised me. Jennifer had always presented such a controlled facade that this glimpse of genuine fear and regret was jarring. "Why are you telling me this?" I asked gently. She took a deep breath, visibly struggling to regain composure. "Because I need to know if your proposal includes a place for me, or if I'm being sacrificed to preserve whatever can be salvaged for everyone else." The question wasn't what I'd expected. I'd anticipated rage, denial, perhaps even threats, not this vulnerable inquiry about her own future. "That depends," I answered honestly, "on whether you're willing to acknowledge past mistakes and contribute constructively to building something better. On whether you can adapt to a new structure where decisions are made based on expertise rather than family position." "You still haven't answered my question," she pressed. Is there a place for me in this new entity you're proposing? I studied her carefully, trying to see beyond years of mutual antagonism to the person beneath. Jennifer was undeniably intelligent, hardworking, and deeply committed to financial services, whatever her initial path into the field might have been. There could be, I said finally. Not as an executive in charge of investment decisions, at least not immediately. That trust would need to be rebuilt, but your client relationships are valuable. Your understanding of traditional wealth management could complement Neuroleap's technological innovations. Hope flickered briefly in her eyes before caution reasserted itself. And Andrew? This was trickier territory. Andrew's recommendation of evolution chain had triggered the crisis, revealing fundamental gaps in his understanding of modern investment vehicles. That's more complicated, I admitted. His role in the evolution chain situation raises serious concerns about judgment and due diligence. At minimum, he would need significant retraining and close supervision in any client-facing capacity. Jennifer nodded slowly, apparently having expected this assessment. He's not handling any of this. Well, she said quietly, he sees it as the end of everything. It's the end of one chapter, I corrected. Not necessarily the end of his career, if he's willing to adapt. She was silent for a long moment, absently turning her wedding ring, a massive diamond that had belonged to Robert's grandmother. When she finally spoke, her voice held unexpected frankness. You know, I've resented you from the moment Michael brought you home, not just because you came from outside our world, but because you seemed so unimpressed by it all. By the connections, the traditions, the Mitchell name. Things I'd spent my entire life being taught were supremely important. They can be important, I said carefully, without being the only things that matter. Maybe. She shrugged slightly. Or maybe they matter less than I was raised to believe, because it turns out all those connections and traditions couldn't prevent evolution chain from destroying everything. The admission seemed to cost her something, an acknowledgement that the foundations of her worldview had proven more fragile than she'd ever imagined. Will you help your father implement the restructuring? I asked, bringing the conversation back to practical matters. If that's the path he chooses? Jennifer looked down at her hands, then back at me with newfound resolve. Yes, because the alternative is worse, and because I need to take responsibility for my part in this situation. It was perhaps the most honest moment we'd ever shared, this acknowledgement of personal accountability from a woman who had spent years projecting perfect competence. Thank you for meeting with me, she said, rising from the table. I need to speak with my father, to let him know where I stand. As she turned to leave, I called after her softly. Jennifer? She paused, looking back. For what it's worth, I think your grandfather would be proud of your decision today. It takes courage to choose painful truth over comfortable illusion. Something shifted in her expression, surprise, then a fleeting moment of genuine connection. She nodded once, then disappeared through the cafe doors into the gathering evening. I sat for a while longer, processing the unexpected turn our conversation had taken. After years of mutual distrust and subtle hostility, Jennifer and I had finally found common ground, not in triumph or celebration, but in the painful acknowledgement of a legacy crumbling and the difficult work of salvaging something meaningful from its remains. My phone buzzed with a text from Michael. Everything okay? I typed back. Yes, coming up now. Something unexpected just happened. As I rode the elevator back to Neuroleap's offices, I reflected on the extraordinary reversal of fortunes that had unfolded over the past 48 hours. I had entered the Mitchell family orbit as an outsider, tolerated but never truly accepted. Now, improbably, I had become the potential architect of the Mitchell legacy's future. The irony wasn't lost on me. For years, they had dismissed my work, as insignificant compared to their venerable financial institution. Yet it was precisely that little tech project that now offered the only viable path forward for the Mitchell name in financial services. As the elevator doors opened, I straightened my shoulders, preparing to bring Michael up to speed on his sister's unexpected vulnerability. Whatever came next would reshape not just Mitchell Financial Services, but the entire family dynamic that had defined our marriage from the beginning. The ground hadn't just shifted beneath Mitchell Financial. It had been completely transformed, revealing new possibilities for connection where only distance had existed before. Morning light streamed through the windows of our condo as I sat at the kitchen island, reviewing the draft restructuring proposal Priya and our legal team had worked through the night to prepare. The document outlined a complex but viable path forward, a new entity, Mitchell NeuroLeap Financial, that would acquire client relationships and select assets from Mitchell Financial Services while implementing rigorous compliance protocols and advanced neural interface technology. Michael placed a steaming mug of coffee beside my laptop, his expression thoughtful. Ready for today? Today. The day when the Mitchell family would formally decide whether to accept my proposal or face the consequences of their increasingly untenable financial position. Robert had called late last night to confirm that the family would meet us at our offices at 10. His voice had been carefully neutral, giving no indication of which way they were leaning. As ready as I can be, I replied, taking a grateful sip. Either they accept the restructuring, or Mitchell Financial collapses and regulatory investigations begin. I've presented the only viable path forward. Michael leaned against the counter, studying me with a mixture of pride and concern. You know, when we got married, I never imagined you'd end up holding my family's legacy in your hands. Makes two of us, I smiled wryly. I was just hoping they'd eventually learn to pronounce my name correctly at Christmas dinner. Memory of those early family gatherings felt almost surreal now. The subtle condescension, the carefully veiled suggestions that I might be happier in a more suitable career. Diane's persistent questions about when we might start a family. Instead of focusing on my computer hobby, how distant those concerns seemed in the face of potential securities fraud and the collapse of a 3-generation financial institution. Whatever they decide, Michael said, taking my hand, you've handled this with more grace and integrity than they had any right to expect. His words warmed me, a reminder of why we'd built our life together despite the complications his family presented. Michael had always seen me clearly, my ambitions, my potential, my worth, even when his family saw only an unsuitable match from the wrong background with inappropriate career aspirations. We arrived at NeuroLeap 30 minutes before the scheduled meeting. I wanted time to center myself, to review the proposal once more, to ensure the conference room was arranged exactly as I'd envisioned. This wasn't just another business negotiation. It was a pivotal moment that would reshape not just Mitchell Financial, but our family relationships for years to come. Priya met us at the elevator, tablet in hand, her expression serious. The legal team made some final adjustments to the disclosure protocols, she explained, walking beside me toward my office. They're emphasizing voluntary cooperation with regulators to maximize protection for individuals while addressing corporate irregularities. I nodded, grateful once again for her impeccable judgment. Priya had been with me from NeuroLeap's earliest days, bringing financial discipline to match my technical vision. She understood that today's meeting transcended business considerations. This was about finding a solution that addressed legal realities while preserving human relationships. Any word from the Mitchell side? I asked. Nothing official, she replied. But I received a text from Jennifer an hour ago asking if we had space for their legal counsel to work on site after the meeting. Suggests they're at least seriously considering acceptance. Michael raised an eyebrow. Jennifer texted you directly? Surprised me too, Priya admitted. First time ever. Usually she pretends I don't exist, or addresses me as Sarah's financial person. I smiled despite the tension. Progress comes in unexpected forms. At precisely 9:55, the receptionist announced the Mitchell family's arrival. Not just Robert and Jennifer, as I'd anticipated, but the entire inner circle. Robert, Diane, Jennifer, Andrew, and surprisingly, Aunt Patty. They were accompanied by an older gentleman I recognized as Walter Harrington, the family's longtime legal counsel. "Reinforcements," Michael murmured as we headed to greet them. "Either they're taking this very seriously, or they're planning to present a united front against your proposal." The Mitchell contingent looked like they'd stepped out of a formal business portrait. Robert and Andrew in immaculate suits, Diane in a conservative St. John knit ensemble, Jennifer in a tailored navy dress that projected professional competence. Only Patty defied the unspoken dress code, wearing colorful linen pants and a hand-woven shawl that spoke of her recent travels in South America. I stepped forward to welcome them, maintaining the professional demeanor this situation demanded, despite the complex personal relationships involved. "Thank you all for coming. We've prepared the main conference room for our discussion." Robert nodded, his expression giving nothing away. "We appreciate your accommodation on such short notice." As I led them toward the conference room, Patty fell into step beside me. "Quite the family gathering," she murmured, just loudly enough for me to hear. "You've accomplished what 3 decades of Christmases couldn't, getting all the Mitchells in one room with a common purpose." Her wry observation broke some of the tension, reminding me that amid all the corporate complications and family dynamics, there was also an element of the absurd in this situation. The tech entrepreneur daughter-in-law they'd dismissed for years was now their potential savior. The conference room had been arranged with careful thought to psychology and power dynamics. Rather than the traditional rectangular table with opposing sides, I'd chosen a round configuration that eliminated physical hierarchies. The NeuroLeap logo glowed subtly on one wall, while financial projections were displayed on another, a visual reminder of the technological and financial realities that had brought us to this moment. "Please, make yourselves comfortable," I gestured to the seating. "Would anyone like coffee or tea before we begin?" Small courtesies completed, we settled around the table. I noted the seating arrangements with interest. Robert directly across from me, Diane to his right, Jennifer to his left. Andrew beside Jennifer, looking pale and uncomfortable. Patty had positioned herself between Michael and Walter, a neutral territory between the competing interests. "I believe everyone has reviewed the restructuring proposal distributed yesterday," I began, activating the main display with a gesture. A simplified version of the plan appeared, key points highlighted. For clarity. But before we discuss specific terms, I'd like to understand where the Mitchell family stands. Have you reached a decision regarding the path forward? Robert cleared his throat, assuming the mantle of family spokesperson as he had for decades. "We've reviewed your proposal extensively, consulting with both legal counsel and financial advisors. The family has engaged in frank discussions about our options and priorities." I noted his careful wording, frank discussions, undoubtedly a euphemism for heated arguments and painful realizations. "After considerable deliberation," he continued, "we've concluded that your proposed restructuring represents the most viable path forward, given the circumstances we face." The declaration hung in the air for a moment. Despite having presented the proposal myself, I felt a surge of surprise that they had actually accepted it. The Mitchell family, with its 3 generations of independent authority and carefully guarded autonomy, was agreeing to a fundamental reinvention under my effective control. "However," Robert added, "we have several amendments to propose regarding governance structure, transition timeline, and the preservation of the Mitchell name in client-facing operations." There it was, the negotiating position I'd expected. Acceptance of the inevitable, coupled with efforts to preserve whatever elements of control and identity they could manage. "We're open to discussing reasonable adjustments," I replied carefully, "provided they don't compromise the core requirements: transparent governance, regulatory compliance, and clear integration of NeuroLeap's technology and expertise." Walter Harrington leaned forward, the movement deliberate and practiced, a lawyer preparing to advocate for his client's interests. "The Mitchell family recognizes the necessity of substantial change," he acknowledged, "but certain elements of heritage and continuity remain essential, particularly for maintaining client confidence during transition." For the next 2 hours, we engaged in detailed negotiations over specific aspects of the restructuring. The discussion was technical, intricate, occasionally tense, but notably free from the emotional undertones that had characterized previous Mitchell family interactions. We were operating in the realm of business necessity now, where personal feelings took a backseat to practical solutions. Throughout the process, I found myself impressed by Jennifer's contributions. Gone was the defensive hostility of our early encounters, replaced by pragmatic engagement with the realities at hand. She demonstrated genuine expertise in client relationship dynamics and institutional knowledge that would prove valuable in the transition. Whatever personal reservations she might still harbor, she was clearly committed to salvaging what could be saved. Andrew, by contrast, remained mostly silent, speaking only when directly addressed. The evolution chain debacle had clearly shaken his confidence, perhaps permanently altering his perception of his own judgment. I felt an unexpected flicker of sympathy for him, despite his role in precipitating the crisis. Having your professional identity collapse so publicly would challenge anyone's sense of self. Diane watched the proceedings with an expression I couldn't quite interpret, somewhere between resignation and calculation. She had always been the social strategist of the family, managing perceptions and relationships with meticulous attention. Now she was witnessing a seismic shift in family status that no amount of social maneuvering could prevent. As we approached agreement on the final framework, Patty, who had observed more than participated, suddenly spoke up. "There's an element we haven't addressed explicitly," she said, her gaze moving between Robert and me. "The disclosure process to regulators." A tense silence fell over the room. We had discussed the necessity of regulatory disclosure in general terms, but had avoided detailed conversation about exactly what would be revealed and by whom. "Our legal team has outlined a comprehensive disclosure protocol," I replied carefully, "emphasizing voluntary cooperation and proactive remediation to mitigate potential penalties." "But who exactly will be making these disclosures?" Patty pressed. "Who will be named as responsible for the decisions that led to this situation?" Walter shifted uncomfortably. "The proposed structure emphasizes corporate responsibility rather than individual culpability. The entity itself would acknowledge compliance failures while implementing robust corrective measures." "That sounds like lawyer speak for no one." "Takes personal responsibility," Patty observed, her bluntness a stark contrast to the careful diplomacy that had characterized our discussion. "Which strikes me as precisely the kind of thinking that created this mess in the first place." Robert's expression tightened. "Patricia, this isn't the appropriate forum." "It's exactly the appropriate forum," she interrupted, something I'd never seen anyone do to Robert Mitchell before. "You're creating a new entity with new values and protocols. If it starts with shielding individuals from accountability, how is that different from the old Mitchell Financial?" Her challenge landed like a stone in still water, sending ripples across everyone's carefully maintained composure. Andrew stared at the table, knuckles white where his hands were clasped. Jennifer's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Diane looked as if she'd tasted something bitter. I caught Michael's eye across the table, reading his silent communication. "This needs addressing." "Patty raises a valid point," I acknowledged, turning to face Robert directly. "The restructuring isn't just about financial and operational changes. It's about establishing a fundamentally different culture. One where transparency and accountability are truly valued, not just in marketing materials, but in practice. Robert held my gaze, something like grudging respect flickering in his expression. What exactly are you suggesting? That the disclosure to regulators should include clear acknowledgement of who made key decisions, I replied. Not to seek punishment, but to demonstrate genuine accountability. To show that Mitchell NeuroLeap Financial isn't just a rebranding exercise, but a fundamental reset of values and practices. Jennifer straightened in her chair. I authorized the inter-entity transfers, she said, her voice steady despite the evident cost of the admission. If disclosures name individuals, mine should be the primary name. Andrew looked up sharply. Jen, no. It's not a matter for debate, Andrew, she cut him off, not unkindly but with unmistakable firmness. I knew what I was doing, even if I justified it as temporary crisis management. The responsibility is mine. Robert's expression softened as he looked at his daughter, perhaps seeing her clearly for the first time in years, not as the perfect Mitchell heir he'd tried to shape, but as a competent professional taking responsibility for her actions. The responsibility is shared, he said quietly. As CEO and chairman, I was ultimately accountable for all firm activities, whether I reviewed specific transactions or not. My name should appear alongside yours in any disclosure. The admission seemed to physically cost him, decades of carefully maintained authority momentarily cracking to reveal the human beneath. For perhaps the first time, I glimpsed the weight Robert had carried all these years, the pressure of preserving a legacy that had been entrusted to him by previous generations. If we're doing this, Andrew spoke up, his voice stronger than it had been all morning, then my role in the evolution chain recommendation needs to be explicitly acknowledged as well. I brought the investment opportunity forward without adequate technical due diligence. Diane watched this cascade of accountability with widening eyes, as if witnessing something she'd never thought possible within her family. Patty, by contrast, smiled slightly, the satisfied expression of someone who had deliberately created this moment of truth. This is unexpected, Walter commented, clearly recalibrating his legal strategy in real time, though potentially beneficial from a regulatory perspective. Voluntary individual accountability coupled with structural remediation could significantly improve our position with the SEC. I nodded, feeling a sudden shift in the room's energy. Something fundamental had changed, not just in the business arrangement we were negotiating, but in the Mitchell family itself. Years of careful image management and deflected responsibility had given way to a moment of genuine reckoning. We'll need to carefully structure these personal statements, I said, bringing the discussion back to practical matters, to demonstrate accountability while positioning them within the context of systemic issues and comprehensive remediation. For the next hour, we outlined a disclosure approach that balanced individual acknowledgement with corporate reform. Throughout the process, I observed a different quality to the Mitchell family interactions, a tentative authenticity replacing the polished performances of the past. Jennifer spoke directly, rather than through carefully coded subtext. Robert acknowledged limitations in his oversight approach. Even Andrew contributed valuable perspectives on how investment processes had prioritized social connections over technical validation. As we finalized the framework agreement, I felt cautiously optimistic about the path ahead. Not just for the business restructuring, but for the human relationships that had been strained and distorted for so long. I believe we have a viable framework, I concluded, sending the final document to the room's displays. Legal teams can begin drafting formal agreements immediately, while our financial teams prepare for client transition and regulatory disclosure. Robert nodded, the gesture carrying the weight of formal acceptance. Mitchell Financial Services will cooperate fully with the transition process. We understand the urgency of moving forward before market speculation begins. As the meeting ended and everyone gathered their materials, Diane approached me, the first time she had ever sought me out directly in all our years of family association. "Sarah," she began, her voice lower than usual, "might I have a word in private?" Michael raised an eyebrow but moved away tactfully, joining Patty's animated conversation with Priya about neural interface applications. I led Diane to a small seating area near the windows, away from the others but still within view. She settled onto the sleek, modern chair, so different from her traditional furnishings, with surprising ease. "This isn't how I imagined Mitchell Financial's future would unfold," she said without preamble. "For decades, I envisioned a straight line of succession. Robert to Jennifer, Jennifer to her children eventually. The Mitchell name continuing unchanged. In Boston finance for generations to come." I nodded, unsure where she was heading with this unusually direct communication. "When Michael chose psychology over finance, I saw it as a temporary detour," she continued. "And when he married you, someone so completely outside our world, I viewed it as a challenge to be managed, a complication in the larger Mitchell narrative." The frank acknowledgement of her perspective was startling after years of carefully veiled disapproval. "I was wrong," she said simply. "About many things, as recent events have made painfully clear, but particularly about you." I maintained my composed expression with effort, unprepared for this shift from my perpetually disapproving mother-in-law. "You've shown more concern for preserving what matters in the Mitchell legacy than many who bear the name," she continued. "You could have walked away when you discovered the extent of our problems. Instead, you've created a path forward that honors the best parts of what we built while correcting the worst of our mistakes." "It makes business sense for Neuroleap," I replied, uncomfortable with her unexpected praise. "The Mitchell client, relationships and institutional knowledge are valuable assets." "Perhaps," she acknowledged with the ghost of a smile. "But your approach to this situation reveals character beyond business calculation. You've insisted on accountability while offering redemption. That's rare." She straightened almost imperceptibly, reassuming some of her customary formality. "I won't pretend that everything changes overnight. Old habits and perceptions are deeply ingrained. But I wanted you to know that I see what you're doing more clearly now, both professionally and for our family." The acknowledgement felt monumental, a threshold crossed after years of subtle resistance and veiled judgment. Not quite an apology, but perhaps something more meaningful. Recognition. "Thank you," I said simply. "That means a great deal." She nodded once, then rose with characteristic grace. "I should join Robert. We have much to discuss before tomorrow's board meeting." As she walked away, I remained seated, processing the unexpected exchange. Diane Mitchell had always been the most elusive member of the family for me to understand, maintaining perfect social composure while wielding influence through subtle cues and carefully managed relationships. This direct communication represented a seismic shift in her approach, suggesting that the family restructuring extended beyond business arrangements to the personal dynamics that had defined the Mitchells for generations. Michael approached, as Diane rejoined Robert. "Everything okay?" Mom looked serious. "Better than okay, I think," I replied, still slightly stunned. "I believe your mother just offered the Mitchell equivalent of an olive branch." His eyebrows rose. "That's unprecedented." "It's been a day for unprecedented events," I observed, watching the Mitchell family prepare to depart, still maintaining their practiced public dignity, but somehow different in ways subtle yet profound. As legal teams began setting up in adjacent conference rooms to draft formal agreements, Priya joined us, tablet in hand. "So," she said, her expression a mixture of amazement and professional satisfaction, "we're really doing this, creating Mitchell Neuroleap Financial. merging neural interface technology with old-school wealth management. Assuming the legal details work out as planned, I nodded. It's a significant pivot from our original roadmap, but potentially transformative for both entities. And for the people involved, Michael added quietly, watching his family through the glass walls of the conference room. This isn't just a business restructuring for them. It's a complete reimagining of family identity. He was right, of course. For 3 generations, the Mitchells had defined themselves through Mitchell Financial Services. Their status, their connections, their place in Boston society, all flowing from that institutional identity. The transformation we were engineering would require them to reconsider not just professional roles, but fundamental questions of who they were and what they valued. It won't be easy, I acknowledged. Changing corporate structures is straightforward. Compared to evolving family dynamics, there will be resistance, backsliding, moments of doubt. Priya grinned. But imagine Jennifer's face the first time she has to present neural interface applications to traditional banking clients. Worth every minute of the complicated transition. I laughed despite the gravity of the situation. That's not why we're doing this. Not the only reason, she corrected with a wink, before heading off to join the legal discussions. Left alone with Michael, I finally allowed myself to exhale fully, releasing tension I'd been carrying for days. I can hardly believe they actually accepted the restructuring. Part of me was convinced Robert would choose to go down with the ship rather than accept external control. Michael considered this, watching his father in conversation with Walter across the room. I think seeing Jennifer take responsibility changed something for him, made him realize that preserving the family legacy isn't about maintaining perfect control, but about adapting to survive. Speaking of adaptation, I said, remembering a detail from our negotiations. Did you notice your father didn't object to the neural interface training requirements? The idea that traditional Mitchell financial advisors will learn to use thought-controlled analytics would have been unthinkable a week ago. Michael smiled. Desperation creates flexibility. But also, I think he's genuinely intrigued by the technology now that he's looking at it as a business solution rather than his son's wife's incomprehensible hobby. The observation captured perfectly the shifting perspectives that had characterized the past few days. What had once been dismissed as inappropriate or irrelevant, my technology background, my different approach to business, my outsider perspective, had suddenly become valuable, even essential, to the Mitchell family's survival. As we watched the various teams begin their work, Michael took my hand, his expression turning reflective. You know, when I walked away from Mitchell Financial to pursue psychology, I believed I was making a clean break from the family legacy. Turns out I was just approaching it from a different angle. How so? I asked, curious about his thinking. Psychology is about understanding human behavior and helping people adapt to changing circumstances, he explained, which is exactly what's happening here. My family is undergoing a profound identity transition, and somehow, improbably, my choices, including marrying you, have created a path for that transformation. I leaned against him slightly, drawing strength from his steady presence. I suppose neither of us followed the expected script, but maybe that's exactly why we're able to see possibilities others missed. Across the room, Jennifer was engaged in animated conversation with one of our neural interface developers, gesturing in a way that suggested genuine interest rather than polite accommodation. Andrew stood nearby, listening intently, some of his earlier stiffness beginning to ease as the technical discussion progressed. Robert and Walter had moved to a quiet corner, presumably discussing board communication strategies. Diane had stepped out to take a call, her posture visible through the glass walls, still perfectly poised, but somehow less rigid than before. And Patty, characteristically, had made herself at home in our staff lounge, chatting with employees, and examining the prototype neural interfaces on display with unabashed curiosity. It was a tableau I could never have imagined when I first entered the Mitchell family orbit. This integration of their world and mine, this blending of financial tradition with technological innovation. Yet somehow, improbably, it felt right. Not perfect, certainly not without challenges ahead, but filled with possibilities that neither side could have created alone. "Ready for what comes next?" Michael asked, squeezing my hand gently. I nodded, watching as the future began taking shape around us. Absolutely. The journey ahead would undoubtedly include complications, setbacks, moments of doubt and resistance. Transforming a century-old financial institution while healing decades of family dysfunction wouldn't happen overnight. But for perhaps the first time since I'd become Sarah Mitchell, I felt like a true architect of the family's future. Not an outsider to be tolerated, but an essential catalyst for necessary change. Mitchell NeuroLeap Financial, I said, testing the name aloud. Has a nice ring to it, don't you think? Michael smiled, his expression holding both wonder and acceptance of this unexpected turn in our shared journey. Better than either name alone. In that simple observation lay the promise of everything to come, not just for our business venture, but for the family it would transform in ways none of us could fully anticipate. Two worlds colliding, breaking apart, and reforming into something entirely new, something stronger, more adaptable, and infinitely more interesting than what had come before. 6 months later, I stood at the podium during the official launch of Mitchell NeuroLeap Financial, looking out at faces that had transformed in ways I never could have predicted. Jennifer, now our Director of Client Transitions, demonstrating the neural interface to a fascinated group of longtime Mitchell clients. Robert, visibly proud as he introduced the technology to Boston's financial community, his earlier skepticism replaced by genuine enthusiasm. Even Diane had embraced change, hosting innovation salons that bridged old money and new technology. The regulatory disclosures had been painful but cathartic, resulting in corporate penalties but minimal individual consequences due to our transparent cooperation. More importantly, they'd cleared the path for authentic transformation, not just of a financial institution but of a family. Financial services meets neural innovation. I concluded my speech to enthusiastic applause. Traditional values enhanced by cutting-edge technology. Michael squeezed my hand as I returned to my seat. Not bad for your little computer project, he whispered. I smiled, remembering Diane's dismissive words from that Thanksgiving dinner years ago. How fitting that her mockery had become the catalyst for saving everything she valued most. Sometimes the most powerful response to underestimation isn't anger or resentment. It's excellence that transforms not just your own future, but the futures of those who failed to see your worth. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories. Right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.